Now I want to show you how to make a slightly more complicated query in Access. So this is one where you're doing calculations actually in the query itself, and I'll take you through all of that, how to add those calculation lines, how to make it across different tables.
In this video, we're going to make a slightly more complicated query. So, I might have a set of data like this one on the player statistics, but you might get a question that says to you, work out how old the player is. Well, you could do that from the players table looking at the date of birth, but that gives you the date of birth, not how old they are. So there's something to calculate there. And then it might want you to count, say, the number of players at each age. So the number that are 16, the number that are 17, the number that are 18. Now that's obviously not something you can do in one step. You're going to need to build two queries. One to work out their age, and then one to work out how many there are of each age. And then you might get something that's asking you, I don't know, how many yellow cards they have been got for each age, or how many goals have been scored at each age. Now, that's building a query on a query. So, let's look at that and how you would do those sorts of examples. So, where you would go to begin with is onto Query Wizard. And having gone on to Query Wizard, you would simply pick that simple query. Now, the first thing I'm going to want on simple query is on the subject of the players. I'm not going to really need to know who the player is, but I'm going to take the player's ID just so that I've got that as a reference point in terms of the player themselves. And knowing the player ID, what I'm going to pull in then is from the positions table. No, not the positions table, the stats table. I want to pull in how many yellow cards they've got and how many goals they've got. So there I've created something that's taking down a set of information. What players have scored, so this is going to be first level of the two-step. And so then that gives me a bunch of players and a bunch of goals. What it doesn't give me is their date of birth. So in design view, I might want to click on this end one, and in this end one, I now need to build an expression. So I could put age. And what is age? Age is an integer. And what is it? It's today's date, take away this field, the player date of birth field. So minus, it's going to go into kind of square brackets and go player DOB. So today's date minus that. Now, because of the way it works, it will give us it in days. So I'm going to divide by 365 just to make sure it gives us it as a kind of as a year. Yeah, 365, obviously 365 days in the year. It's an integer of let's do that first bit there. If I run that, and then I go onto the datasheet view for that, it now gives me those ages of the players. So I've got the ages of the players. Now, the next thing I really needed was to take those ages of the players. I want to make it group on those ages. So I'm going to tell it to do that ascending. Now, if you if you right click here onto totals, it'll naturally throw that down on that totals one and give you another option of things that you can do. So you might sit there and say, I want to sum up the yellow cards each player has got, and I want to know the max for the number of goals a player has got. And that will give me that extra amount of information. Now, again, save it before you go in, but you right click back into the datasheet view, and now you can see I've got a bunch of 18-year-olds, 8 goals, 1 goal, 0 goals, and I actually know the names of those players. Now, if I'd not put the names of the players in, it would have told me each of those groups. So what I can then do is take that query and build another query off it that will summarize that information for us. So there I would close that and go, let's go back to Query Wizard, go back to Simple Query, but this time pick my query. There in that top box, don't pick my tables, pick that first step query. And on that first step query, I'm going to tell it I want to know their age, because I want to really sort by the age group. I want to pick the player ID, but I'm just going to count them. I'm not bothered who the players are. And I'm not going to take the names in. I'm just going to take the yellow cards and the goals and leave the names out of it. Now, at this stage, I can go next, next, and put it as second step query. Finish that. And it gives me those. Now, as I go back into the design view for all the data, and now I'm sat there thinking I want to be able to group it again. So let's choose that, tell it we're grouping it by, it's obviously grouping by that, but we want to do the player ID, and what we want to do is to count how many player IDs there are. Then I want to do a sum on the number of yellow cards. Well, we had that already on the previous one. And we want to do the goals, and we'll stick to max as we're doing on the previous one. And then when I save that and look at the design for that, sorry, the datasheet view for that, you'll see now it just tells me 18-year-olds, there are 3 18-year-olds. There's 1 19-year-old. It's doing that count. There's 2 20-year-olds. There's 2 21-year-olds. That's how many yellow cards they've got altogether, and that's how many goals they've got altogether. And so you can build the sort of really complicated query that's looking at what's their age, how many players are each age, how many yellow cards have they got, by building up those questions and by building up those steps. Now, the only kind of tricky bit, I think, in the whole of that, some of you will argue all of it was a bit more tricky, but the really tricky bit is this bit where you're writing in a formula. So where you're writing in a formula, it's the name followed by a colon, so the name you want the field to be, and then you simply write in what you wanted it to work out. So I knew there was a command called date that gave today's date. There's another one called today that does something similar. And then minus, and then I took the name that was up there that it recognized of the field I wanted to take away. So I knew that would take away one date from another date and give me a number of days. And then what I wanted to do was to divide that number of days by 365 in order to turn it into a year. And that, I think, is a fairly good guide through a more complicated query. And now into something slightly simpler, which is how to build a report from a query that you've done.